Man, how about those Paleolithic people with their egalitarianism? Well, we have another really exciting edition of Western civilization here today because we are going to look at part two and we're going to explore the Neolithic peoples. Be prepared for some big changes. So, once again, grab a pen and paper, a tablet or a keyboard, and get ready for the Neolithic era. So today's focus question is going to be humanity's material and social culture drastically changed during the Neolithic era. Explain. All right, so we're looking again at this material and social culture that we looked at last time. We're going to see that in the Neolithic era, things are about to change very drastically. And, well, let's take a look at it. Okay, so we're going to talk about the material conditions. Now, I mentioned 10,000 years ago, and the question was, what was happening 10,000 years ago that caused such a big upheaval? Well, the answer is the weather was changing. The climate was changing, actually. It was the end of the Ice Age. Now, Ice Ages last a long time, tens of thousands of years. And so, 10,000 years ago, the ice sheets were melting and beginning to advance north. Now, this meant that people's lives were completely turned upside down. If you think about it, these large herds that they had been hunting for a long time followed the ice sheets. The herds went north along with the ice sheets. And so the question is what about people who live in these warmer areas now? Places like the Middle East, whose climate had changed drastically. The Middle East was becoming a savanna. It was becoming a grassland. It was wetter than it is today, but it was like this grassy area. And so the question is, if there aren't these large herds to hunt anymore, what are people going to do? Well, the answer was domesticate plants and animals. And this is what the agricultural revolution was all about. Well, what does that mean exactly, to domesticate? Well, we don't know where it started. Well, we know roughly where it started, the Middle East, but we don't know the details because it wasn't written down, obviously. But it's most likely that it was women that actually invented agriculture. So ladies, pat yourselves on the back. Why would we think that women were the ones who invented this really important invention? Probably the most important invention in the whole history of mankind, by the way. Why would it be women? Well, if you said because they were the gatherers, you'd be correct, right? In all those thousands of years of gathering plants, the secrets of germination, the secrets of seeds, probably became known to people. And so people probably gradually figured out that when you're picking plants, if you shake a little bit and let those seeds fall and maybe kick a little bit of dirt on them so the birds don't eat them, that germination will occur. And next year when you come back to the same spot, well, the field would be all that much more full. And so what people began to realize is they began to experiment with different types of grasses, things like emmer wheat, things like barley, and they began to experiment with burying these and began to cultivate them. And this was a huge, huge invention, because what it does is it turns people from scavengers. Last time I said the hunter-gatherer is a scavenger. The hunter-gatherer goes with hat in hand to Mother Nature and says, please, I'm begging you, is there any food, anything I'll scrape up? The agriculturalist is a food producer. They plant the crops. They produce the crops themselves. They make the food themselves and don't wait for a handout from Mother Nature. They manipulate their environment to give them what they want. Now, I can tell some of you guys out there are feeling a little bit bad about this, that you didn't create agriculture. You didn't invent agriculture. So I don't want you to feel too bad, because there was another really, really important invention, and this was probably guys. And that is the domestication of animals. So having so many humans out there, because agriculture started to create more humans, right? As people started to produce their own food, they started to feed themselves, and there were probably more humans. It probably upset the balance of the animals out there. There were probably less and less of them because there were more mouths to feed. And so it probably occurred to some people that it might be a good idea to preserve some of these animals, maybe to pen them up, right? So you find a herd of wild animals, sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, these animals that were the ancestors of the animals we eat today, and maybe pen them up and save them for future use, right? Back in those days, you couldn't just kill them and refrigerate them, but you can keep them alive, and if you pen them up, you can keep them away from predators and other people. And so people began to pen these animals up. And so these animals eventually became domesticated. You know, over the centuries, if one's particularly nasty, maybe you eat that one first, and if one's a little more docile, you save that one, right? And so you select out the most docile ones. And in time, these animals became domesticated. They became relatively safe to be around. You might select out for sheep, in other words, the ones with the best wool or something like that. And the real change occurred is when we didn't just pen them up and save them to eat them, but we penned them up and we found non-lethal uses for them. For instance, milk from a cow, right? If you have a cow in your pen, maybe it's best not to even kill it. Save it, and every single day you can get milk off of it. Or if you have chickens, you might want to leave them alive because, well, you can get eggs off of them. And now that people are doing agriculture, animals could provide power, right? So you could use a cow to provide you with a little more power. Eventually people learned that you could ride animals and use them for transportation. And so there were all sorts of different ways that you could use animals. Now, back in these olden times, different groups of people tended to specialize in one or the other. Some people were farmers, agriculturalists, and some people were herders. And so we'll see that these two groups coexist. They interact on friendly terms sometimes, and sometimes not so friendly terms. But agriculturalists and herders are going to be two groups that we're going to look at. Now that people are beginning to domesticate things, and now that they're going to be settling down, there was a big explosion of technology, right? For centuries, for millennia, humans had the same simple tools. But now that we're settling down, there's all sorts of new tools that we're going to need. And one of the things that we begin to find is pottery, right? Pottery is something that hunter-gatherers don't use. For one, it's kind of heavy. Two, it's kind of fragile. And neither one of those things are really good if you're going to be moving around a lot. But now that we have all these grains are tough you can't eat them raw, they need to be boiled, and so you're going to need pots to boil them or to store them. And just something that the hunter-gatherer doesn't really need. Another thing that we start to see is people use it making cloth. In the hunter-gatherer days, people tended to wear animal skins, right? There wasn't really any wool available. People didn't know how to use linen yet. And so they tended to wear animal skins. But now that we've got all these sheep in our backyard, we can shear the sheep and we can make thread out of it. And if you look in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see primitive looms. And you can start to make woven clothing. So that's another new invention that's going to emerge at this time. Another thing that we start to see is the smooth axe. Now that people are going to be in one place, they're going to maybe want to cut down some trees. Well, those flint arrowheads aren't going to do that, but you're going to need a flint axe to do that. I mean, you're going to need a polished stone axe to do that. Or now that you're going to be digging up things, you're going to need special tools like these finely polished stone tools. By the way, we call this the Neolithic Era, and the reason we call it the Neolithic Era is because the first thing that archaeologists back in its infancy they found from this time are these smooth, polished stone tools. And people said, whoa, this is very different. I wonder why they're making these tools all of a sudden. They hadn't put together these pieces that I put together for you about the agricultural revolution. All they saw was rocks that were now polished and smooth. And so they called it the Neolithic Era to distinguish it from the older era where the tools were that much more primitive. Another thing that we begin to see is the plow. All right, and this was a really, really important invention. Because what plows allow humans to do is to harness the power of an ox so that they can plow the ground. Now, the earliest agriculturists probably just used sharpened sticks to burrow holes in the ground and plant seeds, which isn't all that effective. To get at the real nutrients that's underground, you need to break up that ground. You need to tear up those weeds, and that's what a plow does. And so the plow was probably the first time humans began to use artificial sources of energy. That is, animal energy instead of their own power to do things. And so the plow was a really important invention because what it allowed people to do is to take the gains that they had from agriculture and just enhance them that much more. You grow a lot more food this way. And so there's a lot of really important and exciting things that begin to happen in the agricultural revolution. And this really affects the way people live, because now that our food is growing outside our houses and we have our animals penned up next to our houses, we don't need to move those houses much anymore. And so we start to see the beginnings of sedentary existence. That it means people don't migrate anymore. The food is right outside your door. Why are you going to chase it down? And so we start to see villages as the norm. People settle down. They start to build more permanent houses. Hunter-gatherers, their houses have to be mobile because they're moving around. But agriculturalists, you can start to build mud, brick houses, walls. By the way, all those tools that you can have more of them because you're not moving around very much, and so you can have a bigger toolkit. And so our living patterns change. Oh, and by the way, remember I said that hunter-gatherers have to live in really small groups of 30 to 40 because, well, Mother Nature doesn't produce anymore. Well, screw Mother Nature. We're growing our own food now, so we'll have bigger settlements of thousands if we want to. And so life changes in the Paleolithic era in this way as well. Also, our economy changes. I said the hunter-gatherer, he lives this hand-to-mouth existence. I said that they don't have very much food, that they live a very primitive sort of economy. Well, guess what? We don't have to live that way anymore. We can begin to accumulate surplus. We can accumulate wealth. Now, not money yet, but we can accumulate wealth. We can grow more food than we actually need because we're controlling nature. We're manipulating nature to serve our wants. Now, this doesn't come, nothing's free in this world. Nothing's free. This comes at a price. It comes at a price of harder work. Remember I said the hunter-gatherer, he can live his life and have his 4 hours of labor, and he can have this, sit around the rest of the time. It's hard work to get Mother Nature to do what you want, right? You need to be more calculating. You need to be aware of what time of year it is, what time you should be sowing, what time you must reap. You need to be aware of the land and keep a mind out for the amount of seed that you're going to need. And so our relationship with nature changes very drastically. We become much more rational. We become much more calculating. It's not that easy living of the hunter-gatherer. And so things change. Now, so far we've been talking about the material culture. We've seen that the material culture has changed with agriculture and herding and living in one place, and the economy has changed. But guess what? Social conditions change as well, and I want to look at this. One of the results of agriculture is the beginning of private property. All right. Now, food isn't free anymore, right? It's not just you walk along and you find an apple and you pick the apple and you eat it off the tree. No, you have to work pretty hard to produce food, right? If you think about it, you got to clear the land of any trees or any weeds. You've got to plow that land. You've got to find seed somewhere. You've got to have seed. You got to plant it. You've got to chase off pests. You've got to keep it watered. You've got to weed it out in the hot sun. Then when the time comes to harvest, there's the whole harvest. And so there's a lot of labor and exertion that's required. Land had to be worked on. And so the idea that if you work on this piece of land, if you've put in that time, well, it just seems wrong if someone comes along at harvest time and just goes, oh, wow, look at all this corn. Oh, wow, I can't believe this is all here. Let me eat, right? You don't want that. And so the idea of private property began to emerge. That if you take this piece of land and you improve upon it, well, damn it, it should be yours. And along with private property comes people who have, and some people have not for whatever reason. Maybe they just happen to work a better piece of land and one worked a worse piece of land. Maybe they're just harder workers. They're out there weeding while the other guy was loafing. Maybe they're wiser, or the other one was foolish. Or maybe they're just more manipulative. Whatever the reason is, we start to have a scenario where certain people have wealth and some don't. And so the class war is begun way back in the Neolithic era. Another thing that we start to see is sexual inequality. And why this is the case is not entirely understood, but it's probably related to childbirth. Now, hunter-gatherer groups, like I said, they like to live in little groups, small groups, and you really don't want to have a lot of kids, right? Because you're moving around a lot. The last thing you want is a bunch of infants and children screaming, and they can't hunt and do very much for the first 10 years of their life or so, and so they're a real headache, especially, there's just not a lot of food out there, and you got to keep the group size down anyways. And so we know from hunter-gatherers today that they practice all sorts of primitive birth control to try to keep numbers down. We also know that agriculturalists today don't have those same types of concerns. Anytime where you see a agricultural society, people tend to have lots and lots of kids. You may know this from your own family's experience. How many people have a great-grandma or a grandma from the old country that's one of 10 or something like this? This is very common in agricultural societies. Once again, as we live in small societies, when you live in a city, not small societies, but when you live in modern societies, you live in a city, once again, kids, well, they become a hassle. And so in the most primitive, the hunter-gatherer, and the most modern, you tend to have small families, but that whole area in between, you tend to have large families. And so anyways, my point is that women in agricultural societies tend to spend a lot of their most productive years, their best years, pregnant. It's not uncommon to find women giving birth to 10 or more offspring. And so, of course, in this state, they're weakened and not able to do quite as much. Furthermore, the plow. The plow requires a lot of strength, more strength than many women have. And so because of pregnancy, because of the plow, men seize the initiative. They become the breadwinners. Women might have invented agriculture, but men seize it, and they become the breadwinners. They're the ones that bring in the food, and this is more valued. Women work hard, no doubt. There's all kinds of women's work, quote unquote, child rearing, grinding grain, weaving, but these were less prized. And so men became the dominant sex, dating way back to the Neolithic era. Another thing that we start to see is we start to see the rise of elites. All right? This hierarchy that I just mentioned in terms of wealth and in terms of sex, we start to see certain individuals in the village, certain individuals who are the big man, the chief. These people will have superior resources. They'll aggregate power to themselves, and they're the ones that really are going to make the decisions. They'll make maybe gift exchanges with other chiefs. They'll associate perhaps with other elites. And we know that this is the case, even though we still don't have any writings, because of burial practices. When archaeologists dig through these Neolithic villages, they'll see people maybe buried with a couple of beads or something like that, and then one person has a weapon, and he'll have gold or something like that. And so we start to see evidence of these elites in burial practice. Another thing that begins to change is religious practice. I mentioned the hunter-gatherer were animists. They had these, everything has a spirit and so on and so forth. But as we settle down, as agriculturists, the forces of nature become more important. We really, really need rain. Because if it doesn't rain, the crops aren't going to grow. And we've lost the ability to hunt and gather, so it's not like we can leave. We're pretty much stuck here. We need that damn rain. The earth becomes very important to us. It's mysterious. Somehow things grow. The sun and its rays are necessary. And so our relationship with nature has changed. We've sought to control nature, and we don't really look at ourselves as part of it anymore. And so the earliest religions emerge, trying to either appease or cajole the elements that we couldn't control directly. We seem like we can control nature, but we really can't. We're really relying on it still. And so the earliest religions tend to be related to fertility, right? People began to personify these forces of nature. That is, give them human personality. And so some of the earliest deities to emerge is an earth mother goddess, right? People couldn't help but notice the similarities, right? Your mother gives you nutrients, and so does earth. And so the earth mother goddess becomes one of the earliest related to fertility. Sky fathers are often found. The penetrating rays of the sun. You do with that image what you want to. Because we use cattle to plow our fields, and ancient people were very imaginative, because cattle horns tend to look like a crescent moon. The moon too became a source of fertility. And there were all sorts of myths. People like to know what's going on, or at least think they know what's going on, and myths help to explain that. And so some of the earliest myths explain why it is that certain times of year things grow, spring and summer, and why in certain times of year things don't grow, fall and winter. And myths help explain that. Usually relates to some sort of a god being taken to the underworld and mayhem, then they're allowed to leave, and there's all sorts of different variations on that myth. But along with religion comes certain individuals who are skilled at talking to the gods or manipulating the gods. And so the priesthood, and many of the priests are the elites. They're the ones who can make it rain, literally. And so they have an awful lot of power in our group. Now, so far we've been describing agricultural societies, Next week, we're going to look at our first civilizations, and they're different. We'll look at what makes a civilization, but I want to briefly mention where our first civilizations are going to be, where we're going next week. The earliest civilizations are sometimes called hydraulic civilizations. And they're called hydraulic civilizations because they originate around water, and specifically around river valleys. And so next week, we're going to be turning to Mesopotamia, where archaeologists believe the earliest civilization emerged. The week after, we'll be going to Egypt. But I just want to mention that there are other places that early civilization also emerged, like in the Indus River Valley in modern-day India and Pakistan, and also in China. And so these are the 4 original civilizations of the Old World. Now, if you were going to be taking an Eastern history class, you would be focusing on China and India. But because this is a Western civilization class, we're going to focus on the 2 Western ones, Mesopotamia and Egypt, which are essentially the grandparents of our own civilization. So we're going to be looking at this area called the Fertile Crescent, which incorporates both Mesopotamia, Egypt, and some of the surrounding areas. Okay, we'll deal with that next week, but what I'd like you to do is to take your notes and think about this. Humanity's material and social culture drastically changed during their Neolithic era. Right? From the Paleolithic era to the Neolithic era. Explain to me how the material culture changed. We've talked about things like how people made a living. We talked about their living patterns. We talked about the economy. Tell me about that. Social culture. We said that the Paleolithic people were egalitarian. Are they in the Neolithic period? We said that the Paleolithic people had a corporate sort of primitive democracy. Is that still the case in the Neolithic era, or has that changed? We said that the earliest people were animists. What about in the Neolithic period? Why are all these changes even happening? So answer those questions, and I'll see you all next week.